Half-Life is one of the most popular games ever made. It has spawned only one sequel with a couple of expansions/spin-offs, but its legacy is so ingrained in gaming culture that just the image of a crowbar alone can begin turning the imagination of many video game fans all across the globe. But arguably, the thing that has cemented Half-Life's mainstay in the pop culture hive mind of video game fans is the abundancy of mods that spawn from the Gold Source engine. Day of Defeat, Team Fortress, Counter-Strike, Half-Life Decay, Paranoia, and They Hunger are just to name a few off of hand. The game spawned so many separate IPs that are now under Valve's branding that it's probably only rivaled by the original Doom in terms of the amount of fan support that the game has gotten. Around 2005, a mod came out called Afraid of Monsters, and it was a mod that gained a lot of notoriety for being one of the scariest games, let alone mods that you could get. It was more or less a conversion mod that totally changed the gameplay of Half-Life to be centered around the horror narrative. It was heavily inspired by Silent Hill and tried to carve out its own identity, taking place in
a dark and gloomy city in Sweden,
and taking liberties among the gameplay and atmosphere aspects. The team that made the mod gained a lot of fans, and eventually they began working on a new game altogether. This would eventually turn into Cry of Fear, and it became something else entirely, even going as far as to get its own separate Steam page download separate from Half-Life. For years, this would be regarded as one of the scariest games that you could ever download onto your computer. A few years later, another team called the Depressic Team, what a fucking sick name, released a mod for Half-Life 2 called Grey. This was also widely publicized as it bared a lot of the same resemblance to Cry of Fear, even going as far as to sharing the same voice actor that voiced Simon from Cry of Fear, but the updated source engine provided so much more detail and dared to possibly go darker than the original mod. But as the years progressed, I personally seem to notice that the reviews for Cry of Fear were mostly, if not unanimously positive, but the reviews for Grey dabbled around mixed to light positive, and only going lower as time went on. Today I'm going to look back at both games and try to give a fair comparison between the two and see which has held up better over the years, and also to see if the negative criticism directed towards Grey has been warranted. Let's compare and contrast Cry of Fear and Grey. Now, I would be lying if I said that both games obviously weren't inspired by the Silent Hill series. It's practically written all over the fucking things. The rusty, derelict, abandoned buildings and the empty, vacant worlds that evoke the melancholic introversion of both games bring to mind the fog-covered town of Silent Hill. But in the graphics department, this is almost objectively an easy point towards Grey, but let's give Cry of Fear a chance. Cry of Fear was a mod for the original Half-Life, meaning it was using the Gold Source engine. It was heavily modded to make the lighting effects to be worthwhile in the dark. The original Afraid of Monsters mod was hugely affected by the Gold Source's lighting. It was basically a tiny tunnel of light that could only light a single object at a time, rendering everything outside of the circle still coaxed in darkness. Cry of Fear fixed this problem by making your cell phone's light much wider and much easier to see in the darkness, but was still somewhat limited by what the developers could do with the engine. Cry of Fear utilizes this engine well enough with very moodily designed areas that are usually drenched in darkness and more often than not push the engine to its absolute limits. It still looks like Half-Life, but only just barely. The total conversion nature of the mod leaves so much new that you almost forget that it is a Half-Life mod. Dimly lit city streets, pitch black apartment complexes, bloody and disgusting creature designs, and well-made character designs and animations help bring the mod to life. Weapons look highly detailed, and the animations are impressive for each one, reload and attack animations both. Grey is a mod for Half-Life 2, Episode 2 to be specific, and of course it looks better than Cry of Fear in almost every respect. The darkness is all-encompassing, the monster designs are more sickening, the ambience is far heavier, the detail allowed in the source engine just allows for more disturbing detail and more psychological scares. The lighting is superb in Grey, and it feels like many of the level designs were built around the shadow and lighting effects. The entrance to the construction site is still one of the most memorable entrances to any horror location in memory. It is so realistic and foreboding that even 6 years after I initially played Grey, it still stands out to me. Nothing in Cry of Fear has stuck with me as much as that. The grimy nature of the Silent Hill games translates well into this engine far more than I would have imagined. Grimy and disgusting hospitals and horrific alternate dimensions come to life in awful detail that really put Cry of Fear to shame. But can you really expect anything otherwise? I will say, however, that Cry of Fear does deserve a special shout out for pushing its engine far, far further than Grey does. Cry of Fear looking as good as it does is truly a testament to the developers and what they were able to accomplish. But when you get down to it, even though Grey is another total conversion mod, it really is just using the engine that is given to it. That being said, the point goes to Grey. Being a mod for the original Half-Life, Cry of Fear has pretty solid movement, albeit floaty and loose. The mod does use the Half-Life staple of crouch jumping, but it's not very frequent. The game bases a lot of its story and narrative progression on the Silent Hill series, as I mentioned before, where you wander about a deserted town for a while and occasionally travel through dungeons, such as an apartment complex, a subway station, a college, a park, etc. The Silent Hill staple flashlight is used to well effect here as you delve deeper into the bowels of some of these locations where darkness is all you can see otherwise. You get a variety of weapons such as a Glock pistol, a shotgun, a hunting rifle, a nightstick, and a sledgehammer. The melee weapons are understandably clunky in a horror game. They definitely tweak the way melee weapons work from the original Half-Life, as the crowbar in Half-Life is easily swung as a kid swings an imaginary greatsword around, like a fucking madman. In Cry of Fear, each swing is heavy and deliberate. Even the switchblade that you get near the beginning of the game is swung very slow and only useful with the game's new feature, the dodge mechanic. With a quick double press of any direction key, you can dash in that direction at the cost of some of your character's stamina. This provides an interesting new dimension to combat in a horror game, let alone one based on Half-Life's engine. But unfortunately, I don't personally think it was implemented in the best way that it could have been. Here's a quick example of a normal melee encounter in Cry of Fear without the dash being used. Now here is one with it being used. Either way, it's not all that exciting, but I do like the team tried to do something fresh with the combat, especially for how heavy the melee combat is. The game is based around it being used, and if it isn't, you will not last very long, especially when you are surrounded, which does happen quite a few times in the campaign. Your health drains fast, the enemies swing faster, and the only way that you can really deal with a mob of them is with the firearms given to you. The guns in Cry of Fear feel pretty solid. The handgun in particular shoots fast and loses accuracy just as fast. The shotgun feels pretty light all in all, but the ammo that you get for it is so scarce that it really isn't a weapon that you'll be using very much anyway. Cry of Fear uses a limited inventory mechanic akin to early Resident Evil games. You can fit 3 items in your bag and 3 items in your pockets. This means that inventory space is a critical resource, and while health syringes will stack, i.e. you can carry 2 or 3 of them and they won't take up more than 1 inventory space, you will often find yourself in a position where you will have to drop something to pick up an important item, such as a more advanced pistol or a shovel that is critical to continue the campaign. You have the option of quick selecting up to 3 specific items, but I find that you will most likely have your cell phone in one of these slots at any given time, given that light is such an important commodity, which means that in reality I would say that you really only have 2 open quick slots. Interestingly, Cry of Fear uses a dual-wielding mechanic which allows you to dual-wield your cell phone and your pistol, for instance, which allows for easier visibility and defense. But in this given example, your accuracy will take a hit for dual-wielding. Again, I have to give props to the developers for pushing the engine so hard. There's nothing quite like this in the original Half-Life. In Grey, the gameplay is obviously molded and modded from Half-Life 2, which in my opinion means that it's a much more fluid feeling combat than Cry of Fear. The melee weapons again have been heavily tweaked to feel much more realistic than Half-Life 2, similar to how Cry did. The animations for all of the weapons feel realistic and heavy. The big fucking stick of stone that you get later in the game feels really good and can easily one-shot most enemies that you come across. It's heavy, and the cooldown time after each swing feels punishing if you manage to miss your swing. The guns are loud and punchy. The pistol in particular feels especially good, and each shot feels like it could blow the brains out of the enemies that you come across. It feels and sounds much better than the standard pistol in the original Half-Life 2 game. Gray doesn't use a modified inventory system like Cry of Fear, it just uses a slightly tweaked version of the standard inventory in Half-Life, where you can use the scroll wheel to cycle through your weapons. There isn't any inventory management to speak of. If you get an important item, then it's held in a separate key item space that is untouchable by the player and can only be used when you arrive at the point in the game when it is required by you. It is a much simpler and streamlined inventory management system, leaning less into classic survival horror and more into just linear horror. This isn't a bad thing for sure, but it does feel less inspired than Cry of Fear. Now, I often hear the argument that Gray is unfair or poorly balanced. I will wholeheartedly admit that the first time I played Gray back when it was new, I did agree with the sentiment. The game does not give you very much health, and the bandages that you come across throughout the campaign only recover about 20 to 25% of your overall health. The medkits that you find can recover up to about 80%, which is awesome, but I think there are only around 5 tops in the entire campaign, so you need to use them as sparingly as possible. But this may sound like me being a video game snob. I think a lot of Gray's criticisms about it being unbalanced are partially born out of the era of gaming that it was released in. Hear me out on this. When Gray was new, Call of Duty was still the #1 video game franchise in the world. Cover-based shooting was still absolutely a thing, and the first-person shooter mindset was still a majority of stand still and shoot. If you go into a game like Gray and play it this way, you will absolutely get fucking destroyed. And my first whole playthrough of this was just that. I specifically remember being frustrated and stuck on the first and only boss to the point where I just gave up. I must have been around at 30% health, and the small doll enemies were just constant enough that I felt like it was an impossible to conquer fight at the point that I was at. But on this last playthrough of the game, I find myself just about in the same position. I was low on health with literally 0 ammo, but with a more bob and weave sort of playstyle, I was able to break the boxes that are in the boss arena, take out the small dolls, and kill all of the bigger arena enemies with health to spare. Playing more first-person shooters in recent years that are geared towards you constantly being moving made me play Gray differently this time, and while yes, the game is definitely hard, I would be lying if I thought it was unfair. When it comes to the comparison, I feel like the tweaks to the gameplay that Cry of Fear make to the engine make such a huge overall difference in the feel of the game that the point leans to Cry of Fear. Gray has a super solid campaign, and I am not discouraging the gameplay of it, but Cry of Fear has more expanded mechanics and more interesting implementations of them. So the point goes to Cry of Fear. Now, despite the obvious comparison between Silent Hill for both of these games, it's hard to deny that not only does Gray take from Silent Hill, but it also takes from Cry of Fear as a main inspiration. Both games open with a nightmare sequence that lead into an atmospheric opening gameplay sequence with not a lot of combat, if none at all. The nightmare section of Gray is much more subdued and feels to me like the developers are trying to get under your skin a little bit, while the Cry of Fear intro is genuinely scary. The camera flash mechanic is so genius that I would be hard pressed to say that there is a scarier intro to any game ever made. Even playing through Cry of Fear a small handful of times beforehand, I can safely say that the opening levels still made me tense and fearful. Gray's opening feels a bit more visceral and in your face, but it's still also pretty subdued. It's not nearly as vague as Cry's intro is, as you see a lot of mind-bending and fucked up stuff in the first few minutes alone, but there is actually no danger in this section, and it is more of a haunted house ride than anything. You go from one room to another and occasionally get thrown some mindfuckery thrown at you, such as the mental asylum room that you get trapped in momentarily. But as creepy as this intro can be, I can't get past the haunted house comparison because that's really all it is. You could argue that Cry of Fear's intro is just another haunted house ride, but it doesn't feel like it due to the interactivity that you have with the camera mechanic. Both games also have a similar sort of introduction to the actual game. Both see you wandering around a deserted town looking for a way back home, and both accomplish this well. Cry has a shorter time frame before you get your first weapon and fight your first monster than Gray does, and that can be argued whether or not that's a good or a bad thing. Personally, I like the longer, more ambient opening section of Gray more than Cry of Fear's. It really puts you in the mindset of how alone you are because you are still seeing such a gross, disgusting side of town, and it really puts the atmosphere of the game front and center. In Cry of Fear, you were exploring a part of town, and I think the gold source engine that the game has to work with just doesn't quite allow for the level of mood that Gray is able to accomplish. And just as a side, Gray uses these disgusting black grime webs all over its locations, and I think it's brilliant. It makes almost every area that they're used in that much more hard to see in, and they help add to the overall tone of each location. As far as scares themselves, I think it really comes down to calling a vase or a vase. Both games use such a similar type of atmosphere and enemy placement that centers around jump scaring the player more than anything, and both games do this effectively and frequently. If you ask me, Cry of Fear is much less focused on what I would call fair enemy placement, and as the game progresses, it has a tendency to barrage you with more and more enemies. There is one spot in particular where you get surrounded by 5 or 6 enemies that I specifically found frustrating and not very scary at all. The apartment complex is the area that I find the most effective in terms of the monsters that you find in there, the overall ambience, and the placement of the monsters themselves. The scares are much more spread out and balanced. Easily one of the scariest parts of Cry of Fear is a section where your phone runs out of batteries and you are forced to wander around a subway station's back rooms while using flares as your only form of light. The enemies that you fight in here are truly disturbing, with their panicked breathing being the only form of letting you know that they're coming. While still relying a lot on jump scares, I think that the sparser enemy placements and the overall heavier atmosphere of the game lean to Gray being a scarier experience. In my opinion, Gray knows how to unsettle the player better than Cry does without having to resort to monster encounters. There is a part in Gray very early on in the construction site where you walk into a room that has no purpose, but it's just a big empty room with nothing in it but a cement mixer, and it's still somehow creepy by just being a big room. Another example I can turn to is another early section where you see your first enemy whiz by you, and you can't really comprehend exactly what it was. You turn a corner and walk up some stairs expecting to be ambushed by the monster at any given second, and you see this graffiti of a man standing. I can guarantee you that anyone who hasn't played this game will get startled by that. It's a genius use of scaring the player without resorting to anything cheap. There was a much better use of jump scares in terms of enemy placement due to the environments being much more cramped and the monsters' designs, in my opinion, being far more unsettling. Speaking of which, I think that's a good time to transition into the monster designs. Cry of Fear and Gray both utilize symbolic enemy designs akin to the Silent Hill series, but almost to the detriment of the inevitable comparison. Neither game comes close to the quality of the enemy designs in the original 4 Silent Hill games.
I would argue the first 3, but let's just roll with it.
However, both games still do have some highlights. Both games use heavy symbolism when it comes to the individual monster designs that are relevant to the main character that you play as, and vary in terms of actual quality monster designs. Cry of Fear more or less has a lot of variants of deranged humans covered in blood, which is fine, but the monster designs are at their best when they diverge from the standard monster palette. The faster monster in particular is a humanoid-like doll with huge metal spikes for arms and legs, and the carcass monster in particular are very, very creepy and push the boundaries by making something look human, but it is different enough that makes you feel uncomfortable just by looking at it. In Gray, I think that the monster designs are stronger, even if there are less of them overall. The most common enemy that you fight is, to put it lightly, strangely similar to the common enemy in Cry of Fear. But the way that they float and glide towards you is particularly unsettling and gives this common enemy design the edge in Gray. The disturbing wagon enemy stands out as a highlight for me because of just how rare it is that you see it, and the look of it reminds me of a kid being severely injured in a wagon accident, and even though I was sort of talking smack on the intro nightmare sequence, the two-headed enemies that I think only show up here in particular are a highlight and are truly Silent Hill-esque. All in all, I think both games are genuinely frightening, but I think in the end, the Source engine just lends itself to moodier areas, better lighting, creepier and more thoughtful monster designs, and a much heavier atmosphere. So in the end, the point goes to Gray. Now, as far as horror games go, it's definitely not uncommon for the game to rely on puzzle sections to break up the flow of the game and make it a little bit more interesting. I love puzzles in horror games because it's actually a sort of brilliant way to have you be scared and then have to think rationally to solve a puzzle, and both games do have a variation on puzzles. Cry of Fear usually has one main puzzle per chapter. Most of them are pretty simple, such as like code-based or password-based puzzles. Occasionally, you will need an item to use on something else to progress. The park statue puzzle in particular is a huge standout. It uses a classic survival horror creepy poem to give you the information that you need to solve the puzzle, and I find it to be particularly well made. It's easily the most difficult puzzle in the game, requiring lateral thinking as opposed to either finding a code or finding an item to use somewhere else, as most other puzzles in the game are. Which isn't a bad thing for sure, as I would argue that most old school horror game puzzles are simply find item, get item, use item. There is a light puzzle in the early part of the game where you have to find a username and a password for a computer to find a lock combination, and there is even a boss fight that is a sort of a puzzle. The mace boss is an environmental puzzle where you have to electrocute him with the valves in the arena. The elevator in the apartments is locked behind a passcode, and you need to find a videotape, find a TV to use the videotape on, and the videotape will give you a combination that you can use on the elevator. There's an interesting combination lock that the player is given the first 3 numbers for, and the player has to guess the last number. Something like this is used in Silent Hill 2 in the Historical Society. I honestly don't mind it as a one-off type puzzle. There are physical puzzles, there are simple combination puzzles, and there are item combination puzzles. And while they're all simple, they're spread out enough and have enough variety among them that the puzzles are never boring, annoying, or monotonous, and I appreciate the effort put into each one. Technically, Gray does have puzzles, and they are more or less the same variety of get item, use item about 2 times, and then find a combination for a keypad about 2 times. Maybe 3. But that is the extent of the puzzles. Hey, future me here. I completely forgot about the puzzle at the very end of the game where you have to follow wires and flick on power switches in order to unlock a door to get to the end of the game. That's the best puzzle for sure in Gray. There are so few puzzles and so little variety that it has the opposite effect of Cry of Fear, where those simple puzzles were okay because the puzzle types were never used consecutively and felt different enough from each other. I don't want to sound like I'm saying that zero effort was put into the puzzles here, but the videotape puzzle in Cry of Fear alone is more interesting and complex than literally all of the puzzles in Gray combined. This is a short and easy point for Cry of Fear. I can remember just about all of the puzzles off of memory alone, and they're complex enough that they stick out. So the point goes to Cry of Fear. Being games so centered around the inner demons of our protagonists, it makes sense that the story is a very key component to both of the games. Cry of Fear is centered around Simon Henriksen, a young man who, due to an unfortunate hit-and-run incident which he calls the Black Day, is left a paraplegic. Simon's life is horrifically altered after the accident. He is suicidal and left to defend for himself alone in an apartment. He visits a doctor who tries to help his mental state by giving him drugs like citalopram to try to help with his depression, as well as writing his negative thoughts into a book as a form of therapy, and it turns out the entire game that you're playing is the story that Simon writes into his book, each monster being a representation of his negative thoughts and feelings, all stemming back to the Black Day. There are 2 choices in particular that help determine the ending of the game that you get and how positive the ending could be, and each instance isn't as blanket as a yes or no option. For instance, if you choose to fight the carcass demon after Sophie kills herself, then symbolically, Simon is conquering his emotional trauma of being rejected by Sophie in real life. If you choose not to fight the boss, then it represents Simon running away from the heavy burden that he feels that he caused to make Sophie leave him. The other main instance is whether or not you trust the doctor character that you see occasionally throughout the game. At one point, he requested that you give him a gun to defend himself. You can either give him your handgun or not. If you do, it represents Simon learning to trust his doctor and try to open himself up to therapy. And if you refuse, then it's Simon refusing to accept help. In both cases, they are the trigger for what ending you get. There are 4 possible canonical endings that are all pretty much tragic, but what's nice about the writing, unlike a lot of wannabe Silent Hill knockoffs, is that the main story of the game isn't altered based on what ending you get. Looking back on the overall story, it's actually kind of shocking how in-depth the developers were able to make the story overall and the symbolism translate to the character. Simon is a relatable, if not slightly generic, character, and his story is well executed and worth exploring. While not as vast and as expansive and as theory-inducing as something like Silent Hill 2 is, I can't deny that the level of thought put into the whole story is quite remarkable. Gray's story is a lot less fleshed out, and it isn't quite as in-depth as Cry of Fear, but I think that it's still a good horror story in its own right. Strangely enough, a majority of what is important is stuff that happened before the events of your character's birth. It's a lot more of a deranged story than Cry of Fear, and a lot more upfront about it. The game itself follows the events of your character, whose name is Gray, who, due to a growing self-hatred after his mother died as a kid and was sent to an orphanage, accidentally cripples his coworker and stabs his boss, killing him. The game's events must be the mental trauma that Gray is dealing with as he is escaping from the incident. The monsters in the game are again relevant to Gray's inner demons. The most common enemy being unable to use their legs and having to glide their way towards you is probably relating back to the accident that happened with his coworker. Gray's mom often makes an appearance as a deformed monstrosity and actually hard to see, probably representative of the lack of presence in his life. The story of Gray isn't nearly as fleshed out or nearly as in-depth as Cry of Fear, but goddamn, the implications that Gray suggests are fucked up. For example, the only boss fight in the game is prefaced by you having to piece together the body of a girl with several disgusting heads surrounding you that I can only assume to be the distorted visage of your mother. Once you piece the girl together, you undergo the boss fight. Turns out, the boss fight must have been a paranoia-induced psychosis because this is what was really happening. God damn, that will never not be upsetting. More is uncovered when you play the game in hard mode, which isn't unlocked until you beat the game at least once, which, if you ask me, is kind of a whack way to present a story. A lot of people won't play a game more than once, especially if the second playthrough has to be on hard mode. So gatekeeping the story behind a second playthrough is kind of a slide towards the game's story. All in all, like I said previously, Gray has a good story buried in there. But Cry of Fear's story is just so much better presented, better told, better fleshed out. It has more depth, more meaning, more symbolism behind it, and Simon as a character is just way more interesting. I was actually kind of shocked while editing this video how much story there actually is behind Cry of Fear's narrative. So the point is going to Cry of Fear. And there you have it. Cry of Fear comes out on top by a fucking baby toe. In the end, I think that Gray is the scarier game, but Cry of Fear is way better than the sum of its parts. Don't get me wrong, I would still highly recommend that you go out and play Gray. Both of these games are free anyway. I don't think that the harsh criticism that the game has gotten in recent years has really been deserved, let alone the seemingly abandonware treatment it has gotten, especially on the game's own fucking wiki. On these last playthroughs, I was shocked as to how impressive Cry of Fear still felt after all this time. I spent years hoping for another introspective Silent Hill game, and there it has been just sitting there all along. I never bothered to look in the story when I played it for the first time because I just wanted to get spooked. But now I can look fondly on the game with a newfound love for it because when I care about the character in a horror game such as this one, I want them to be okay. Cry's best ending makes me feel hopeful for Simon, and I hope that this video inspired you to give these games a chance. This is just a little side. I'm practically winging this last part here. It's 2:17 in the morning. I gotta go to bed, but I can't not talk about this part. Cry of Fear has 30 unlockables, which is insane for a mod. It has, it looks like 10 outfits. It has 5 pages of Simon's book that you can find. What do they do? Fuck if I know, but you can find them. It has 4 weapons, and then it has 2 separate game modes, and then 2 separate extra items, which is insane. The replay value for Cry of Fear is out of this world. And there's also a joke ending and an Afraid of Monsters like bonus level. Gray does have an unlockable difficulty mode, which is how you get the true ending. And it also has a fun little separate bonus mode that you get 4 or 5, possibly 10 challenges that vary in terms of direction. There's one I remember where you have to crawl on glass. There's a side-scrolling 8-bit bonus mode. They're fun little like variety challenges. But that's, if I remember correctly, that's the extent of the bonus stuff in Gray. So, I'm not going to score this section, but if I were to give it a section, obviously the point goes to Cry of Fear.
Tomato is a fruit, but it's also a vegetable.